Hi everyone, welcome to the first episode of our podcast for January Stalking Action Month. My name is Julia.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Liz, and we're the Events and Outreach team at SAFER.
Today in this episode, we'll be talking briefly about some of the events we have planned for January Stalking Action Month, a little bit about the definition of stalking and some myths, and then go into some detail about the show You and how it glamorizes stalking in the media. So to begin, some of the events we have planned for this month are a rejection resiliency workshop, a community panel featuring Cal Poly Police Department, Campus Health and Wellbeing, the Civil Rights and Compliance Office on campus, and then Lumina Alliance. And finally, in the last week of the month, we have a keynote presentation from Adam Dodge about the digital age of stalking. We also have a social media campaign on Instagram and have booths on Wednesdays and Thursdays in the UU featuring information about conflict styles, affirmations, and community building, and then online dating.
So for the theme of this first podcast, we're going to be getting into the definitions and some myth busting of stalking. So a lot of people think that stalking is often done by strangers. It could be following you while you're walking down a street, but really stalking is a repeated pattern of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause fear. And cyber stalking is that repeated pattern of behavior over the internet, and it could happen in the context of a relationship or could be perpetuated by someone the victim or survivor does know.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. And when we're thinking about that definition of stalking, it's important to ask ourselves, what does stalking look like on our campus? According to the climate survey, only 32% of people being stalked actually named it that way. This tells us that a lot of Cal Poly students don't really know the signs of stalking. According to some Google survey responses, many people don't know why people stalk. They don't know that it can be rooted in power and control. A lot of people aren't comfortable with conflict resolution strategies, and people don't know resources to help their friends that are survivors of stalking. On the plus side, though, we know that people do seem to understand how media portrayals of stalking are not always representative of how it happens in real life. That being said, our critique of the show You, what we're going to talk about just now, is complex. On one hand, the show itself could be a critique of the toxicity of the romance genre. Nonetheless, the show does concede to the more problematic tendencies of romanticization and glamorization of stalking patterns and behaviors in the media.
Yeah, I really agree with that, and I think it depends on the viewer and their understanding of stalking and their experience with and knowledge about stalking behaviors. You know, it might seem to one person, they might understand the critical aspect of the show and its commentary about stalking, but another person with less knowledge about it might get trapped in that hot, creepy matrix of the main character, Joe, and see it as almost normal behavior or acceptable, which can be really problematic.
I think that was really common. Like, you can see over social media and, like, Twitter, I hear a lot of, like, tweets and jokes about, like, Joe being attractive or, like, people almost taking, like, Joe's side sometimes if they don't agree with, like, whoever his partner was at the time that he was stalking. Like, it's like, oh, he has their best interest in mind, but they don't understand that, like, it's rooted in power and control and not just, like, seeing him as, like, an attractive guy.
Right, and I think this is really important when we're critically consuming media, to be able to, understand the complexities of different pieces of work and, trying to navigate them in the most healthy and socially responsible way. And in, thinking about media critically, it's really important that we implement an intersectional lens and consider how identity and marginalization factor into how people perceive stalking in the media.
Yeah, like, for example, some of Joe's behaviors might be excused because of his identities as a white cisgender male, he those identities are typically associated with power and dominance and having control in relationships, and so it might be seen as acceptable for him to have that domination in the relationship when in reality it should not be that way.
I think another privileged identity he has that carries him a lot is, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he's college educated, and I think that gives him like a lot of credibility in like viewers of like, you know, or his partners, the people he dated in the show and all the seasons, like thinking like, oh, he knows what's best for me, or he knows like better.
Yeah.
I think that like was something that really like pushed him, and like viewers see him as like what you said, Julia, like an educated like white male.
Right, and I think that trend of like intellectualizing stalking and making that it seem like some sort of glorious pursuit, when in reality it's not glorious or glamorous. It's violence, and we need to all prevent it and take action to do so.
Yeah, definitely. There are actions we can take to prevent stalking and change the culture that promotes and normalizes these behaviors. But it is important to remember that stalking behaviors and all forms of gender and power-based violence are never the victim or survivor's fault. What we are going to share are simply risk reduction techniques that may help.
So we wanted to share with you some tendencies and red flags to really understand the mind of someone who stalks. So a big one is sort of a sense of narcissism, where there's like a lack of respect and boundaries, where this person doesn't know how to cope and deal with rejection. And I think a big one also is fantasy. So it could be like creating romantic scenarios of, you know, their victim or target that might not actually be happening in that relationship. And so that makes them like dependent on others to bring them happiness. So when those ideas don't come to fruition, the stalker often doesn't know how to deal with this rejection and may turn to obsessive patterns of monitoring their partner. And I think a big example that we wanted to highlight was in You, especially the first season. You can kind of see how Joe creates like fantasies of him with Beck, and then when she doesn't meet those expectations of him, he's like, I think you can do better. He, you know, engages in all these behaviors that tries to change her life in some way.
Right, thanks, Liz. And I think when we're talking about prevention education, it's really important to focus on boundary setting and receiving, and those coping mechanisms in relationships that people need to develop. Oftentimes we talk a lot about boundary setting, but don't talk about boundary receiving. In relationships, it's always important to respect the preferences of others, even if you don't necessarily resonate with them yourself. This is a practice in empathy, and it's nonlinear, and it really has to do with communication and connection with your partner. It can feel tricky navigating boundaries when they feel like rejection, but because boundaries are necessary for our relationships to be both safe and sustainable, we have to practice receiving no's from the people in our lives. So this sort of idea of boundary setting and receiving and navigating rejection, these are all topics that we're going to explore this next Tuesday in our Boundaries Resiliency Workshop with counseling services.
You can register for these events at safer.calpoly.edu/JanSam. That's JANSAM.
There is more information about stalking and other forms of gender and power-based violence also on our website. We have advocacy services and prevention education efforts. You can find information about those also on the website. And for more information and specifics about the events throughout January Stalking Action Month, check out our Instagram at CalPolySafer. Thank you so much for listening to the first episode of our January Stalking Action Month podcast. We are grateful for your dedication to creating change in our campus community and the world.